This recreation is of a woman's suit jacket from this 1925 image of Edna St. Vincent Millay taken by photographer Berenice Abbott. I found the pattern for the jacket on Etsy. There are many historical and historical reproduction patterns for sale there.
I found this pattern for 1925 travel suit. It has some details on it here on the sleeves and on the front, and I can just leave these details on the front off, but the collar looks good, the length looks good, and it has a skirt that goes with it. So I think this is all I'll need for the suit part.
The pattern is a print-at-home pattern that needs to be taped together, and then the pieces are cut out. I cut the mock-up out of unbleached muslin without making any adjustments to the pattern first. The mock-up is pinned and sewed together. The lapel and collar on the pattern were too big when compared to the photograph. I drew in a smaller lapel and then cut along the line to see how it looked. What I didn't notice at this stage was that the set of the sleeves was not quite right. I should have fixed it at this point, but I didn't. This would become a problem later.
So here's the difference between the collar on the pattern versus the collar I think I want. So the collar on the pattern is quite wide, and I think it's too wide based on the photographs I'm working with. I think this side is now closer to the photograph than this is. So I'm going to finish cutting this and then adjust the pattern accordingly. And I don't think I'm going to mock this up again. Also, this seam here, which is part of the pattern, I'm going to take that apart and make this all one piece, because this seam doesn't exist in the photograph.
I then adjusted the pattern using the changes I had made to the mock-up. So here I have some hair canvas, which is cotton or linen warp with, in this case, goat hair added to the weft. So in the direction of the warp, you can see that it folds quite crisply. And then in the direction of the weft, you get these like big bubbles as you try to fold it. So this adds structure to a tailored suit. So I'm going to cut the interlining out of this, and it has to be done in a very particular way because of how it folds. So I've just done a bit of research into that. The lapel is cut parallel to the selvage so that when you bend over, it bends quite nicely. But this roll back of the collar has a bit more structure to it. The underside of the collar section in tailored garments apparently is cut on the bias, so at 45 degrees, and with a seam down the center back for the under part, the interfacing, and then the top section is cut on the straight grain on the fold, so it looks good, but the interfacing and the under piece are cut on the bias to allow it to stretch around the neck a little bit better. So because there is no seam allowance at the center back here, I'm going to just trace it and then cut about 1/2 inch seam allowance just by eye, but I will have the stitch line already here as to where this begins to connect. I cut these pieces out of the hair canvas, marking the line of where the lapels rolled. I also cut the wool at the same time. So this is the first version I did where I cut both on the bias. They are on the bias, like that's the straight grain, doesn't stretch, and it definitely stretches this way. But these white lines were running in the wrong direction on one of the pieces. They're supposed to make like a herringbone here. So these are the lines that I'll use to follow as I'm pad stitching the collar. Pad stitches are very small basting stitches that are permanently left in the garment and meant to create shape in the lapels and collar. The stitches are done over the curve of your index finger. I followed instructions found in videos on YouTube since none of my historical books give instructions for tailoring. So half of the pad stitching is done now. It's not super even, and you definitely can see it from the other side, but I've never done this before, and so it's as good as I can do. There's not a whole lot of shape to this yet. There's a little bit at the end where you can see it's kind of curved a little bit. But in here, I wasn't really doing it very well. So hopefully the next side will be better. And I think that pressing it with the iron will help the shape as well.
I ended up unpicking and re-sewing one side of the collar several times trying to get it right.
I've redone just this section of pad stitching, trying to put a little bit more shape to it. This has more shape in it now than it did originally. I'm going to move on to the second side and just do it again around my finger. And I probably won't film this section because I already have documentation of how it was done. And I can go and sit in a more comfortable chair and do it on my lap instead of on the table where you can actually see what I'm doing. I finished the pad stitching on the collar turn back here. It's got a lot of curve in it. When you flip it over, you can see that this piece of fabric is curving. This side is almost completely flat. This was the first side I did. This is the second side. Clearly my dyslexia got mixed up here because I didn't get a lot of herringbone. I got a lot of stitches going in the same direction, whereas this side was herringbone. I genuinely couldn't tell you what I did differently, even though I know I was clearly putting the needle in the wrong direction, but in my head it didn't make any sense. So I've thought about it. I'm gonna unpick this side completely, redo it entirely now that I think I've got the knack of how to pad stitch this properly. So I've redone the pad stitching on this side. It's got a bit more shape, but still not, I don't know what I'm doing. And I don't have the time to do it again. This section clearly didn't work out. So I'm gonna quickly do this area here and then press it, and it will have to be fine because I tried 3 times now and I don't know what I did on this side that made it. I don't know. It's really frustrating and I don't know.
Here's all the finished pad stitching in the collar.
So after having done a bit more research on tailoring, I think that this canvas piece is not just the turn back of the collar. I think that this canvas piece should basically be the entire front, and then it will be cut in from under the arm. But it should certainly cover all of this bit. So I might have to recut these before I start pad stitching, because if I think I pad stitched these, I was hanging it on myself and it looked kind of weird, like there was this kind of line here where this wasn't hanging very normally at the very front. You could kind of tell. You can kind of see there that wrinkle that shows where it's been reinforced and where it hasn't. And I think I think that this wool is a little bit too thin for this project, but it's too late now. It's almost $100 and I've already cut it, so it's what we're using. And only this section here will be pad stitched so that the collar wants to curve back. But it does look a little bit funny, so I think I need to recut these sections.
I then recut the front interfacing out of the hair canvas, eyeballing the curved line. I traced this piece upside down to get the shape for the other side. Here you can see the difference in shape between the 2 interfacing pieces. I basted the interfacing to the wool using large basting stitches and a contrasting thread. I did not baste the lapel. I marked out the lines where I would be pad stitching for the lapel. The only thing that made the lines I could see on the canvas was a Sharpie. Next, using thin linen tape, I sewed a length along the lapel roll line. This stabilizes the line since it's not on the straight grain. I sewed this in using a whip stitch. I pad stitched the lapel, holding the fabric in the shape I wanted it to sit when the pad stitching was finished.
So I finished the pad stitching on my first lapel. It has a bit of curve to it, which is kind of nice. It's got a little bit of shape. And the black thread actually is a lot better than the dark blue thread I was using. It looks a lot better. So I think now the step is to trim the seam allowance and add in more linen tape along these edges to just reinforce everything. Tailoring is really hard, this pad stitching and trying to get shape into the fabric, and I'm definitely not doing it right. It has a tiny bit of shape, but when I see these videos of people doing it, the fabric wants to stay in that curve, and mine just doesn't. And I really don't think that I have the time to perfect this. So I think I'm just going to treat it as interfacing, that I've just stitched on interfacing to this piece of fabric, and hope that the pressing of the iron is going to work.
Next, I trimmed the seam allowances and added in more linen tape to stabilize the edges. The last hand sewing in this section of the jacket construction was to cross-stitch the curved edge to the wool. I did this very carefully, only catching the inside of the woolen weave so that the stitching would not show through to the outside.
Here are my two front bodice pieces at slightly different stages. I've kind of moved ahead with one of them in one way and the other in the other. So here I have the seam allowance cut off and the stabilizing tape pinned in, so that has to be stitched here and all the way down. This one, the seam allowance has to be cut off, the new tape has to be put in. Here I've cross-stitched this curved edge onto the fashion fabric, only catching the inside so the stitch doesn't go through to the outside. I need to do that on this piece. It doesn't look great from the outside, but I'm hoping that once the pad stitching is out and all of this basting stitching, once that comes out and I iron it, that will look better. And worst comes to worst, I can always just take it out. But I think it kind of needs to be there to keep this whole thing stable. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to follow stuff that I see online, but the whole information isn't there, and because I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm not entirely sure what to look for. So I'm trying my best, and it's okay. So there's a fair bit more hand sewing to do on this piece and on this piece.
All this hand sewing on these two pieces took about 4 days of work. Next, I moved on to machine sewing. I trimmed the seam allowances on the collar piece, pinned it to the top part of the collar, and sewed it on the machine. I also basted and stitched the lining out of a dark silk. I stitched up the side and shoulder seams of the jacket next. While pressing the seams that had hair canvas in them, I pressed them with the steam and then put my sleeve board upside down, since I don't own a clapper, onto the seam and waited for it to cool. This made the seam really flat since the hair canvas did not want to stay in that shape. Here's the seamed up jacket with no sleeves.
This is incredibly difficult to wrap my head around, this camp collar. I've done it 3 or 4 times now, and every time I have to look up how it's done. I'm using this video that shows how to do it on a shirt, but I'm essentially doing the same thing with my suit. It's just this kind of collar. So to do this camp collar, I'm going to stitch up the fronts, basically right on this line where my interfacing ends, all the way to this point here. And I have the other collar sandwiched in here. That's what this is. I'm going to do that on both sides and then deal with the rest of the collar.
I sewed the front and the lapels, catching the ends of the collar. I then cut slits through all layers of fabric where the seams stopped. The lapel facings are pinned and sewed to the top of the collar. The bottom interface section of the collar is then stitched to the jacket.
So when I pinned this collar in, I centered the back. I didn't check. It's not even on both sides. So I gotta deal with that now. This is so far from perfect, and I keep making mistakes because I've never done anything like this before, and I didn't do this on the mock-up, which was a mistake. I've just stitched everything back into place now the way it should be, and the gap on either side is even. I measured it, pinned it. I should have done that in the beginning. I didn't. I trusted my center was center, and my center wasn't center. So now I'm just going to press this the way it's supposed to be pressed, turn under, and start all the hand sewing. Oh, I have to do the arms still. I realize I haven't cut those out, so I have to cut those out and then set those.
I then press the lapels before stitching up the sleeves. Attaching the sleeves to the jacket was really tough to do on the machine.
Set the sleeves. They're sitting kind of weird, and you can see there was a mistake in the sewing there. And then this side is kind of has a bit of a bubble that needs to be fixed. So I'm gonna have to unpick bits and probably hand sew the parts of the sleeves back in again. They are sitting a little weird. I don't know what to do about that. I think some pressing will help.
I ended up unpicking parts of the sleeves and hand sewing them in, and then pressing the seams. Next, I dealt with the hem. This involved trimming the hair canvas and turning up the bottom edge and pinning it into place. I then pressed the hem with the iron.
I'm really worried about bagging out this lining. I don't think I have the skill to do that. So I think I'm going to make a decision that's more of a dressmaker's decision than a tailor's decision, which is I think I'm going to sew the lining in by hand instead of by machine. It will take considerably longer. It's not, I believe, accurate to how the piece would have been made. If it was a proper tailor's piece, they would have known what they were doing. But from the videos I've seen online from people who reconstruct items like this, tailored items, they do often sew the linings in by hand. So I think that that is what I am going to do. I'm not necessarily happy with that decision, but I think it's the only way forward at the moment, given the time and my ability. And I guess it is historically accurate if it's hand sewn. I guess that's debatable, but that's basically where I'm sitting at the moment with everything that I've got to do.
I did find some photos of this coat that I saw in the Leicestershire County Council archives, which I visited October 20th, 2023. This coat is dated to the 1940s. The lining is entirely hand sewn, including the arms, so there is historical evidence that linings were sewn in by hand. I pasted the hem on the arms and the bottom of the jacket. I then pinned in the silk lining. I then began the long process of whip stitching the silk lining to the wool. The last step was to add the buttons and buttonholes. Because the wool frayed so much, I made a practice buttonhole using silk thread just to make sure that it would actually work. I sewed the buttons on and then marked the buttonholes on the jacket and sewed them using a buttonhole stitch and silk thread. Here is the final jacket, the front and the back with the buttons done up. Here are the buttons and buttonholes. Here you can see the pad stitching on the underside of the collar. And here you can see the lining sewn in by hand. Here are the decorative buttons on the sleeves. And finally, here's a comparison between my recreation and the original image.